It is the 31st of January 1858. On the banks of the Thames in London, thousands look on in awe at an iron leviathan that towers over them on the riverbank. The 19,000-ton ship, which has been the obsession of its designer, is, after several failed attempts, finally launched into the water, where its construction will be finished afloat. A year later, whilst on board the giant vessel, the same man suffers a stroke and dies, never seeing his creation, at the time the largest ship ever built, set sail on her maiden voyage. His name? Isambard Kingdom Brunel, history's greatest engineer. The man known to history as Isambard Kingdom Brunel was born on the 9th of April 1806 on the island of Portsea, now part of the city of Portsmouth, on the south coast of England. His father, Mark Brunel, was born in 1769 in Normandy, in France, while Mark's father, Isambard's grandfather, intended for him to become a priest. Mark wanted to be an engineer and joined the French Navy. The French Revolution of 1789 troubled the royalist Brunels, and in 1793 Mark was forced to flee to the United States, one of tens of thousands of royalist and conservative political refugees who left France in the wake of the Revolution. In America, he was appointed chief engineer of New York City in 1796 during a formative period in the city's history as it grew to eclipse Philadelphia as the foremost urban center in the young country. While Mark was still in France, he had fallen in love with Sophia Kingdom, a young English lady who was working as a governess in the city of Rouen in Normandy after being stranded there when war broke out between Britain and France. Mark had to leave Sophia behind when he escaped to America, but the two continued to exchange letters. After Sophia returned to her native country in 1795, Mark was anxious to join her. Soon he had an opportunity to do so. At a dinner party with Alexander Hamilton, one of the country's founding fathers, in 1798, Mark heard that the British war effort against France was hindered by the lack of wooden pulley blocks for the rigging of sailing ships. Seeing an opportunity to rejoin Sophia, Mark designed a machine to simplify the manufacturing process for pulley blocks. In early 1799, he sailed to England, carrying his designs and a letter of introduction from Hamilton, which he presented to George Spencer, the First Lord of the British Admiralty. Mark wasted no time in seeking a reunion with Sophia, and in November 1799, the couple were married at St Andrew's Church in Holborn, in London. It was a lucky thing that the union had ever occurred. After Mark had eloped from France years earlier, Sophia had remained in the country, even as Britain found itself at near continuous war with the French from 1792 onwards. As a British woman, she was eventually arrested in October 1793 after the French government imprisoned all foreigners on suspicion of espionage. She was only released after the radical revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre was ousted in a coup known as the Thermidorian Reaction in August 1794, and a less radical government came to power. Thereafter, Sophia had been able to return to England to live with her brother in London until such time as Mark joined her again and they were wed. Between 1800 and 1805, the couple had 2 daughters, Sophia and Emma, before the birth of their first and only son in April 1806, to whom they gave the unusual name Isambard Kingdom. The family had moved to Portsmouth in 1802, after Mark's proposals for manufacturing pulley blocks received the backing of Sir Samuel Bentham, the Inspector General of Naval Works and a younger brother of the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. A factory was set up at the naval dockyard in Portsmouth, where Mark was contracted to supervise the manufacturing process. Isambard Kingdom Brunel grew up at a time of revolutionary change in Europe. The French Revolutionary Wars that had separated his parents for several years in the 1790s continued into the 1800s, morphing into the Napoleonic Wars over time. Many Englishmen had sympathized with the initial aims of the revolution and welcomed the fact that France was becoming a constitutional monarchy, but the execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793 had prompted Britain to declare war on the French Republic. The German powers of Prussia and Austria had already been at war with France since April 1792, and Europe would not see a stable peace again until 1815. In France itself, political order was temporarily restored after General Napoleon Bonaparte took power as first consul of the Republic in 1799 before making himself emperor in 1804. Between 1805 and 1807, Napoleon defeated the major continental powers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia in quick succession, enabling him to dominate the European continent. Across the English Channel, Britain was the only major European power to remain undefeated, and the blockade of French ports by the Royal Navy prevented Napoleon from launching his desired invasion of England. An attempt by the French Navy to break out of the blockade in 1805 ended with the defeat of an allied Franco-Spanish fleet by Admiral Horatio Nelson and the British Royal Navy at Trafalgar in October 1805. The Royal Navy's control of global maritime trade strengthened the British economy, which was experiencing the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. From the 1770s onwards, technological innovations encouraged the development of factories and the specialization of labor, lowering the costs of production and increasing profits for entrepreneurs. While science and technology was more advanced in France, financiers and industrialists in Britain enjoyed political support to pursue their projects. Although the Napoleonic Wars had a significant impact on the British economy, Britain escaped the devastation of the European continent, and the process of industrialization could continue undisrupted. During the first half of the 19th century, Britain continued to be the leading industrial power in the world, and Brunel would play a major part in Britain's economic development during this period. In 1808, when Isambard was 2 years old, the family moved to Chelsea in southwest London, where they would live for almost 2 decades. Mark Brunel's work on pulley blocks made his reputation in England, and in 1808 he built a sawmill at Battersea across the Thames from Chelsea, where he implemented measures to increase the efficiency of timber processing. The following year, he began to mass-produce boots for poorly equipped British soldiers, and in 1812, he was commissioned by the Royal Navy to build a sawmill at the Chatham dockyard in Kent. Despite his contribution to the war effort, Brunel was often not paid the full amount he had been promised by the British government, and the family's precarious financial situation would eventually lead to disaster. As the only son of the family, young Isambard was brought up to follow in his father's footsteps. The young boy benefited from the close attention of his father, who taught him to draw at the age of 4 and the basics of Euclidean geometry at the age of 8. Mark was impressed by his son's abilities and sent him to a boarding school at Hove in Sussex, where he studied classics and made a survey of the town in his free time. He used his knowledge of engineering to astonish his classmates by predicting the imminent collapse of poorly designed buildings. In 1815, peace was restored to Europe after Allied armies led by the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher defeated Napoleon decisively at the Battle of Waterloo in what is now Belgium. This was the second time Napoleon had been defeated, and this time the victors made sure he could never pose a threat to the peace of Europe again, exiling him to the utterly remote island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Marc Brunel was glad to see the restoration of the House of Bourbon to the French throne in the aftermath of Napoleon's demise, but he was now a British citizen and made no effort to return to his native land with his family. Nevertheless, he believed his son would benefit from a French education, and in 1820, 14-year-old Isambard was sent off to France. The teenage Brunel was initially enrolled in the College of Caen in his father's native Normandy, now Caen University, before moving on to the Lycée Henri IV in Paris. In 1822, at the age of 16, Isambard spent several months working for the clockmaker Abraham Louis Breguet, who was impressed by the young man's inventive potential. Marc had hoped to send Isambard to the prestigious École Polytechnique in Paris, which Napoleon had transformed into one of the most advanced academies for military engineers anywhere in the world, but Isambard's English birth disqualified him from obtaining a position here. Therefore, he returned to England in August 1822 to become an assistant at his father's office at 16 years of age. During Isambard's absence in France, Marc Brunel had fallen into debt as a result of a series of failed projects that had run into trouble in a post-war environment in which his designs were no longer as necessary. He spent 3 months in debtor's prison in Southwark as a result, where the dutiful Sophia joined him and helped him with his work there. After his initial appeals to the government were unsuccessful, Marc sought assistance from Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who had been impressed by his work on pulley blocks more than a decade earlier and had invited him to St. Petersburg. After writing to the Tsar, Marc also went public with his criticisms of the British government for failing to pay him for his work during the war, and then incarcerating him for unpaid debts years later, as though the debts were not really those of the government. Following the public outcry, Marc Brunel's influential political friends, including Lord Spencer and the Duke of Wellington, persuaded the government to pay him £5,000 to clear his debts in exchange for a promise to remain in England and not travel abroad to share his engineering ideas with other governments. The British were particularly keen to avoid him entering the employment of Russia at a time when the Great Game, the name for the rivalry between the Russians and the British in Central Asia, was just beginning. Hence, after leaving prison, Mark Brunel returned to work with a wide range of projects. Young Isambard was involved in supervising operations at a Sheffield ironworks which was making the iron for 2 suspension bridges in the French colony of Réunion in the Indian Ocean. Isambard was about to set out on his own engineering career at this time. It is worth briefly reflecting on the environment he would work in. While the Industrial Revolution had changed Britain, this first Industrial Revolution, as it is now termed, was quite limited in some respects. It had taken place in the half-century after 1770 and was primarily focused on revolutionising the textile industry that formed the backbone of the British economy in those days. Factories had been set up to engage in textile production on a mass scale, and steam power was employed for the first time to reduce the need for sheer manpower. Coal mining had expanded accordingly to feed the new factories. However, it was not until the 1820s that a truly revolutionary period of engineering would begin in England. The first railway lines would be laid down in the late 1820s, and the 1830s and 1840s saw a revolution in transport as thousands of kilometres of railway line were laid down across Britain. Soon people would begin wondering how the steam engines which propelled locomotives across land by burning coal could be employed to propel ships across the Atlantic Ocean. There were also all kinds of new innovations being introduced in the fields of metallurgy. Though it would take until the mid-1850s until modern steel was first produced in England, many people were already working in the 1820s on ways to manipulate iron and other metals to produce more durable metals. Stronger metals could hold greater loads, and this meant stronger bridges and other types of engineering. All of this would culminate in 1851 in the Crystal Palace exhibition in London, a fair showcasing many thousands of pieces of new engineering and inventions. A few years later, plans to develop a modern sewerage system for London were being initiated. Thus, the period from the 1820s to the 1850s was in many ways an engineering revolution after the first Industrial Revolution. Isambard Kingdom Brunel would be absolutely central to this engineering revolution. The young Brunel spent much of his time in the 1820s experimenting with the gas engine. At a meeting of the Royal Society in London, Mark Brunel listened to a lecture by its president, Sir Humphry Davy, who noted that Michael Faraday had recently invented a method to liquefy natural gases under pressure. Davy suggested that by using a small amount of heat to convert liquefied carbon dioxide back into gas, it was possible to generate energy much more efficiently than by using steam. Mark Brunel decided to investigate the feasibility of such an engine, but despite some encouraging experiments, the difficulties involved in the casting of metal strong enough to withstand the high pressures involved eventually caused the project to be abandoned. At around the same time, the French scientist Sadi Carnot was in the process of formulating the first law of thermodynamics, which demonstrated that energy could not be created or destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. This meant that Davy's concept was physically impossible, but British engineers were unaware of Carnot's work for decades. Despite the failure of the gas engine, Mark Brunel saw greater success in patenting an improved steam engine which ran more efficiently. Isambard watched all of these developments closely as he began to enter his late teens. While Isambard would one day eclipse his father's achievements, in the 1820s he was still very much learning from him. Father and son would embark on their greatest collaboration in June 1824, when Mark Brunel was appointed engineer of the Thames Tunnel Company. For several centuries, the only crossing over the River Thames in London was London Bridge. But demands created by the rapidly increasing population in the 18th century led to the construction of several bridges further upstream. A new river crossing was also required to the east of London Bridge, but a bridge was out of the question since it would prevent tall sailing vessels from accessing the London dockyards. In 1805, Richard Trevithick, a mining engineer best known for his pioneering work on steam locomotives, led a group of Cornish miners to build a tunnel in East London. The miners were used to working with hard rock and struggled to make progress with the soft clay under the Thames. By 1809, the project was abandoned, and Trevithick concluded that it was impossible to tunnel under the River Thames. The versatile Mark Brunel took an interest in the project, and by 1818 he had patented a tunnelling shield that consisted of a cast iron frame to protect workers as they were excavating the tunnel face. After examining the route of the proposed tunnel between Wapping on the north bank of the Thames and Rotherhithe to the south, Brunel modified his design to make a rectangular frame that accommodated 12 men at the tunnel face. Work began in 1825, and soon Brunel's shield was installed under the river. He anticipated that the work would only take 3 years, but the project faced a series of challenges and would take 6 times as long. Isambard initially served as an assistant engineer, but after the departure of resident engineer William Armstrong, the 20-year-old was promoted to succeed him in January 1827. For the next 18 months, Isambard worked closely with 2 assistants, Richard Beamish and William Gravatt. By now in his 50s, Mark Brunel was primarily concerned with the overall direction of the project and dealing with the company's fractious board of directors, leaving Isambard and his assistants to oversee the day-to-day work underground. Here, Brunel was working 12-hour days, 6 days a week in often poor conditions. By the spring of 1827, almost 500 men were working on the project, and the tunnel was approaching its halfway mark of 600 feet, approximately 180 meters. On the 18th of May, 1827, disaster struck after the riverbed collapsed on top of the shield and flooded the whole tunnel. Thanks to the efforts of Isambard and William Gravatt, no lives were lost. Despite the cramped working conditions, the company directors attempted to improve the company's financial position by selling tickets to see the unfinished tunnel as a kind of tourist engineering attraction. In November 1827, Isambard held a dinner for 50 guests, and Richard Beamish arranged for the band of the Coldstream Guards, his former military regiment, to provide musical accompaniment. However, 2 months later, in January 1828, as the tunnel reached its halfway point, the tunnel was flooded once again. On this occasion, 6 workers died, and Brunel himself narrowly avoided drowning by being rescued by Beamish. Brunel would spend several months recuperating from the ordeal, and work on the tunnel came to a halt. It would only resume 7 years later, in 1835, after Mark Brunel had raised sufficient funds to recommence it. Despite further flooding, the tunnel was finally opened to the public on the 25th of March, 1843. By then, Mark had already been awarded a knighthood by Queen Victoria in 1841 for building the world's first underwater tunnel, which was subsequently converted into a rail tunnel and continues to be used by the London Rail Network. While Isambard played no further part in the construction of the Thames Tunnel, he had gained considerable experience as a project manager and leader of men from the experience. After experiencing how his father was forced to compromise on safety by his directors to save money, Isambard resolved that he would never be coerced by financiers to act against his own better judgment in engineering matters. Brunel struggled with his health throughout 1828 and made several trips to France. A combination of poor physical health, the near-death experience while working on the Thames Tunnel, and the cessation of tunnel works seem to have had a major impact on Brunel's psychological state at this time. The morbid sentiments he expressed to friends were in stark contrast to his bombastic ambition to command a fleet of steamboats in the Royal Navy with which he would, quote, take some island or fortified town, which he confided to a private journal begun in October 1827. He also shared his thoughts about the women in his life, making reference to Ellen Hume, a young lady from Manchester whom he had apparently already known for almost 7 years at the time of the diary entry. Although he considered making a proposal of marriage, by 1829 he decided that he could not marry her, even though his romantic affection appears not to have diminished. Throughout his diary, Brunel referred to his habit of dreaming up, quote, castles in the air, personal ambitions and professional projects which he believed would never be realized. In between his and his father's efforts to revive the tunnel project and his continued experimentation with the gas engine, Brunel entered a competition to design a bridge spanning the Avon Gorge near the Bristol suburb of Clifton. Brunel had never designed a bridge before and asked his father for guidance. Mark argued that the gorge was too wide for a single span and proposed a Chinese-style pagoda rising from the bottom of the gorge to support the structure. Isambard ultimately rejected this idea, and instead, in November 1829, he submitted 4 variations of a single span of some 270 meters, though the technical drawings did show his father's input. The competition's judge, Thomas Telford, was the president of the Institute of Civil Engineers and had recently completed the Menai Suspension Bridge in Wales, connecting the island of Anglesey to the mainland. Telford rejected all the submissions before presenting his own design, which included 2 large towers rising over 70 metres from the gorge. Brunel was incensed by the display of corruption and wrote to the committee arguing that Telford's towers were too heavy and would collapse. In 1830, the Bridge Committee determined that Telford's design was too expensive and reopened the competition with new judges. Although he knew that his initial proposals were structurally sound, Brunel modified his proposal to build a large abutment on the western bank to shorten the span to 200 metres. Meanwhile, in late 1830, he received a commission to design an observatory for the astronomer Sir James South at his home in Kensington. Brunel had an interest in astronomy and was a friend of Sir John Herschel, whose father, William, had discovered Uranus in 1781. The observatory was complete in May 1831, but not long afterwards, South complained to Brunel that the costs of the project significantly exceeded Brunel's initial estimates. An anonymous article published in the Athenaeum Journal criticized Brunel's mechanical shutters and argued that, quote, "This absurd project has no other object than the display of a tour de force." Brunel was deeply hurt and was advised by his friend Charles Babbage, the mathematician and computing pioneer, to take South to court for libel, but Brunel soon dropped the matter. In the late 1820s, the Bristol Bridge Committee once again decided against Brunel's proposals for a bridge across the Avon Gorge. But the young engineer refused to accept defeat. In March 1831, he went to Bristol and met with the members of the judging panel and persuaded them to adopt his design, arguing that it was the most structurally efficient way to undertake the project. Work began in July 1831. The 25-year-old Brunel was well set on the path to engineering stardom, but within a few months the project ran into difficulty. Aside from the usual financial and engineering challenges, in late October 1831, the city of Bristol experienced 3 days of rioting after the House of Lords rejected an early version of the Great Reform Bill, legislation which was under consideration in the British Parliament in the early 1830s to significantly expand the voting franchise in a country where only well-off men were allowed to vote in the early 19th century. As one of the largest cities in the country, with a population of over 100,000 people, Bristol was a strong centre of support for the reform of the electoral franchise, which at the time only allowed 6,000 people in the city to vote. The Reform Bill proposed by Earl Grey's Whig administration intended to widen the franchise and rebalance parliamentary constituencies towards the rapidly growing cities. The Reform Bill would eventually become law in June 1832, and in the general election later that year, Brunel campaigned extensively on behalf of his brother-in-law and closest friend, Benjamin Hawes, and helped him win election as Member of Parliament for Lambeth in South London. The political instability in Bristol following the riots caused building work on the suspension bridge to be suspended. Brunel had also been looking for work elsewhere in the country, and in November 1831 he was commissioned to design docks at the mouth of the River Wear in the northeast of England, which was struggling to export the vast quantities of coal extracted from the area. On a visit to the area, Brunel settled on a location at Monkwearmouth on the northern bank of the Wear in Sunderland. He then travelled across the country to Manchester, where he visited the Hume family and took a ride on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which had opened a year earlier. Brunel was impressed by the potential of rail travel and predicted that passengers would soon be able to board trains that would travel smoothly at 45 miles per hour. When he returned to London and presented his plans for the Monk Wearmouth dock, they were rejected by Parliament as too expensive. In the summer of 1832, Brunel's Bristol friend Nicholas Roche invited him to carry out a review into the condition of the harbour in Bristol. For centuries, Bristol had been the most important port on the west coast of England, but during the 18th century it lost its primacy to Liverpool, where new docks were able to accommodate larger merchant ships. At the beginning of the 19th century, the so-called floating harbour was built in Bristol to enable ships to remain afloat at low tide, but within 20 years the harbour's efficiency had deteriorated due to the build-up of silt. In a report submitted to the Bristol Docks Company in late August, Brunel made recommendations to remove the existing silt by dredging and to increase the flow of water to prevent further accumulation. While most of Brunel's recommendations were deemed too expensive to implement, some minor changes improved performance. Brunel also concluded that the floating harbour was too small, but the city's merchants insisted on keeping the facilities in the city centre. Brunel would often clash with port authorities over the following decades. In February 1833, Nicholas Roche informed Brunel of a railway project to connect London to Bristol, which was backed by several directors of the Clifton Suspension Bridge Company. Roche told Brunel that the Railway Committee were seeking proposals and would accept the one which offered the lowest costs. Brunel was infuriated by the penny-pinching attitudes of the merchant class and informed the committee that while his proposal would not be the cheapest, it would be the best. Brunel's arguments persuaded the committee, who appointed him to survey the route. He travelled back and forth between London and Bristol to determine a suitable route through the hilly terrain and completed his survey within a matter of weeks. In July, a committee of directors was formed in London to complement the one in Bristol, and at their first joint meeting in August 1833, Brunel was officially confirmed as engineer of what was to be known as the Great Western Railway. While he continued to receive occasional advice from his father, by now Brunel had established his credentials as an independent engineer. He was a visionary who saw the new railway as part of a new network that would connect the country together and enable people to travel long distances quickly and cheaply. In September, Brunel was asked to undertake a more detailed survey of the route, while the railway's directors still had to raise capital before seeking parliamentary approval. The fundraising effort was led by Charles Saunders, secretary to the company's London committee, who became a close friend and colleague. When the new session of Parliament opened in the autumn, the directors initially sought approval for 2 short stretches of line from Bristol to Bath and London to Reading. In addition to opposition from landowners and farmers unwilling to have a railway line run through their backyard, Eton College, which lay near the proposed railway route, complained that the railway line's proximity threatened to damage the morals of the pupils who would have easy access to London and all its temptations. The 11 days Brunel spent giving evidence to the committee enabled the bill to pass the Commons, but major objections remained in relation to the proposed terminus at Vauxhall in South London and other issues that led one opponent to quip that the scheme was neither Great Western nor a railway. After the House of Lords voted the bill down in July, Brunel and his company directors set out to revise the bill by changing the proposed London terminus from Vauxhall near Lambeth in South London to Euston on the northern side of the city, from where it would join the London and Birmingham Railway. Brunel had a further concern about passenger comfort, believing that existing rail carriages were too narrow and had a tendency to sway at higher speeds. The existing track in the country had been laid to a narrow gauge of nearly 5 foot, following the standard set by the father and son team, George and Robert Stephenson, who were responsible for the construction of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Hailing from the mining communities in the northeast of England, the Stephensons were primarily interested in using rail to transport commodities such as coal. The comfort of passengers was an afterthought. In contrast to their approach, Brunel envisaged rail as a means of transporting the general public around the country and began working on a broad gauge measuring around 7 feet, one which would be more comfortable for passengers to travel in. This would enable him to place his carriages between the rails and lower the centre of gravity, providing for a smoother ride and faster speeds. The Great Western Railway's initial proposals envisaged the track to be laid to Stephenson's narrow gauge, but, without informing the company's directors, Brunel persuaded Lord Shaftesbury, who was drafting the revised bill on the company's behalf, to delete the reference to Stephenson's gauge, thus giving himself the flexibility of building the railway to his broad gauge. By February 1835, the Great Western Railway Company had raised enough seed capital to present a revised bill for the whole length of track between London and Bristol. Brunel's plan included a tunnel almost 2 miles in length under the hills to the east of Bath, near the village of Box. This particular element of his plan was targeted by the supporters of rival London and Southampton Railway as a point of weakness, who put forward the science professor Dionysius Lardner to give evidence to Parliament, claiming that if the brakes of the locomotive were to fail inside the proposed Box tunnel, the gradient of the tunnel would cause the train to emerge at the other end, travelling at 120 miles per hour, which would increase air pressure and suffocate the passengers on board. The science of travelling at such speeds was still very unclear at the time, and people literally did not know if this was true or not. After Brunel refuted the claims, the bill passed both Houses of Parliament, and at the very end of August 1835, the plans for the Great Western Railway Act received the royal assent from King William IV. 2 weeks later, Brunel informed the company directors that he intended to build the railway to a broad gauge to accommodate passengers in some degree of comfort, and won their approval for this plan. In December 1835, the company directors abandoned the terminus at Euston in favour of temporary station facilities at Paddington in West London, as the London and Birmingham Railway was not keen on connecting with the Great Western Railway with a different gauge. As he approached his 30th birthday in April 1836, Brunel had many things going his way. Not only had work begun on the Great Western Railway, but the Thames Tunnel was revived, and his revised plans for the docks at Monkwearmouth also received parliamentary approval. A few months later, construction also resumed on the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Brunel's professional success had a major impact on his personal life. Since 1832, he had been a frequent visitor to Kensington House, the home of William Horsley, a musician and composer whose 5 children included talented artists and musicians. Brunel was particularly attracted to the 19-year-old Mary Horsley, the eldest of her siblings, who was strikingly beautiful but lacked the artistic talent of her brothers and sisters. Brunel had courted Mary for several years, and by May 1836 he determined that his finances were secure enough for the couple to get married. After a wedding in Kensington that July, they moved to a new house at Duke Street next to St James's Park in London. Even after their marriage, Brunel continued to prioritise his work, while Mary often stayed in London to manage the household. The couple would have 2 sons and a daughter between 1837 and 1847. In early 1835, even before the Great Western Railway received parliamentary approval, Brunel demonstrated to the company's directors that his imagination and ambition was boundless. As the committee expressed reservations about the scale of the project, which was to be the longest railway line in Britain up to that time, Brunel joked that the project was not big enough, and the company should build a steamship called the Great Western, operating from Bristol to New York, thus providing passengers with the opportunity to travel from London to New York directly on a train and steamship, both called the Great Western. While the directors laughed at the suggestion, Brunel and his friend Thomas Guppy stayed up late into the night investigating the idea seriously. The company directors gave their approval in October 1835, and in 1836, Brunel and Guppy formed the Great Western Steamship Company. Before work could start on the Great Western ship, Brunel had to deal with difficulties involving the railway. Brunel's broad-gauge train design and his desire to run his trains at high speed required flat terrain and a reasonably direct route. Brunel addressed this by building bridges, viaducts and tunnels to maintain a straight and level route, which would be nicknamed Brunel's billiards table. In the interests of passenger comfort, Brunel also redesigned the track by choosing to support the rails with evenly spaced wooden planks. The bridges and viaducts on Brunel's route were impressive architectural monuments in their own right, such as the Horncliffe Viaduct over the River Brent, but these added to the expense of the project. The Box Tunnel was the most challenging of them all. Work began in September 1836. The workers struggled to cut through the hard limestone. Furthermore, heavy rain caused the shafts to be flooded, and the tunnel was not completed until 1841, 4 years after the line was due to be completed. While the line was being built by 2 teams of workers, starting at each terminus and meeting at the middle, difficulties at the Box Tunnel meant that progress on the western end was slow, while the eastern portion proceeded at a quicker rate. Brunel hoped to design his own steam locomotives to operate on the railway, but the engines built to his specifications were not only unreliable, but cumbersome and undermined his desire for high speed. In August 1837, Brunel was fortunate to recruit Daniel Gooch, a 21-year-old engineer with experience building steam locomotives for Robert Stephenson in Newcastle, who was an enthusiastic supporter of Brunel's broad gauge. After realizing that the engines built to Brunel's specifications were not up to scratch, Gooch persuaded Brunel to purchase the North Star and Morning Star, two locomotives he built at the Stephenson Company, which were originally intended for export to New Orleans. Stephenson agreed to convert the locomotives to run on broad gauge before sending them to the Great Western Railway. While most of Brunel's time during this period of his life was taken up with matters relating to the Great Western Railway, in the summer of 1836 work began on the SS Great Western, what would become the world's first major oceanic steam-powered ship. It was being built at William Patterson's shipyard in Bristol. Alongside Thomas Guppy and former Royal Navy officer Captain Christopher Claxton, Patterson was part of a small building committee which gave expert advice to Brunel. Brunel's critic Dionysius Lardner sprung up again and argued that it was impossible to build a steamship to cross the Atlantic because the coal required to fuel it would be so heavy that the weight of it would negate any advantages gained from using steam power instead of wind power to propel the ship. Undaunted, Brunel observed that the volume of the hull of the steamship he envisaged would be several cubic meters wider, allowing for the storage of greater amounts of coal and greater load-bearing. A larger ship would, therefore, be more efficient. After sending the members of the committee to investigate how steamships were being built in the shipyards of the ports of Glasgow and Liverpool, two of Britain's leading ports of the industrial age, Brunel made some improvements to the engine and strengthened the hull. The result was a paddle steamer over 70 meters long, the longest ship in the world at the time. Although Brunel and his colleagues tried to keep quiet about the Great Western to prevent rival shipping companies from beating them to a steamship service from Britain to New York, the British and American Steam Navigation Company of Liverpool kept a close eye on the Great Western and was itself building a ship named the British Queen for the transatlantic passage. Upon seeing Brunel's rapid progress, they set the British Queen aside and instead attempted to make the first crossing of the Atlantic with a steamship by chartering a much smaller steamship, the Sirius. Thus, on the 4th of April 1838, the Sirius departed for New York from the port of Cork, in the south of British-ruled Ireland. Just a few days before this, the engine room of the SS Great Western had caught fire, and Brunel had his second near-death experience when he fell from a burning ladder onto his friend Christopher Claxton, who carried him onto the deck. After the fire was extinguished, Brunel was set ashore. Despite the setback, repairs were quickly carried out, and on the 8th of April 1838, the SS Great Western began its maiden voyage across the Atlantic, hoping to beat the Sirius to the United States. Because of the accident, Brunel could not take part in the voyage. Still, the result satisfied him. Despite the Sirius having a 4-day head start, the Great Western gained ground quickly on it, with the Sirius having to slow down to preserve its dwindling fuel supply as it continued on. When the Sirius limped into New York on the 22nd of April, the Great Western was not far behind and arrived later that day. Although it had narrowly missed out on the accolade of being the first steamship to cross the Atlantic, the Great Western was considerably faster and became the first regular transatlantic steamship service, making almost 50 crossings between 1838 and 1846. While the Great Western ship was already in operation, the prospects for the Great Western Railway were less promising. In June 1838, an eastern section of the line opened between London and Maidenhead, but Brunel's modifications to the track had not made the ride any smoother. After commissioning a couple of reviews that criticised Brunel's approach, the Great Western Railway Board planned to appoint a second engineer to work alongside Brunel, leading Brunel to threaten to resign. In January 1839, a powerful group of northern shareholders, known as the Liverpool Group, attempted to remove Brunel at a company meeting, but Brunel won the vote. Further sections of the line were being opened in stages, and Gooch began building the new Firefly class of locomotives which could run at 50 miles per hour. Since the locomotive fleet was outgrowing the temporary facilities at Paddington, in 1840 Gooch proposed building a maintenance facility near Swindon, then a small hilltop market town in North Wiltshire, which would open in 1843. Brunel not only designed the train sheds, but also accommodation and public buildings for the workers. A hotel was built inside the station to offer refreshments to passengers in what was one of the first major instances of travel hospitality. Although Brunel had missed several deadlines for the completion of the line, on the 3rd of June 1841, a Great Western Railway train ran a direct public service for the first time between London and Bristol, making the 118-mile journey in 5.5 hours. The construction work had run considerably over budget, but Brunel had defied his critics and become a nationally renowned engineer. Brunel nearly didn't live long enough to enjoy his success. In April 1843, he suffered his third near-death experience when he was entertaining his sons by hiding a coin in his mouth and accidentally swallowed it. Although he was still able to breathe, the coin was lodged in his windpipe, and his efforts to remove it made national headlines. Eventually, his father came up with a solution, designing a device which turned him upside down and enabled the coin to slowly descend out of his windpipe. By 1843, Brunel was preparing to launch a second transatlantic steamship. The Great Western Steamship Company had always envisaged building a sister ship to the SS Great Western, but Brunel had grander ambitions. In 1838, he had dispatched Patterson and Claxton to investigate the prospect of building the ship with an iron hull rather than a wooden one. After a positive report, Brunel set out to build the SS Great Britain, a ship weighing almost 3,500 tons, 7 times that of the largest iron-hulled ships of the day. Work began in July 1839. The design would evolve over time, particularly so after Brunel saw the SS Archimedes enter the Bristol docks powered by a screw propeller in the early summer of 1840. After sending Guppy on board the vessel on its journey to Liverpool, Brunel persuaded his directors that he had to redesign the SS Great Britain to incorporate elements of the screw propeller. This work eventually caught the attention of the Admiralty in London, which invited him to oversee trials for its use in the Royal Navy. Brunel accepted the assignment as a means of obtaining useful data for the SS Great Britain, and the trials were successful. In July 1843, construction of the Great Britain was completed, and Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, was the guest of honour as the ship floated from the dry dock into the floating harbour, where it would be fitted with its engines and boilers. By March 1844, the ship was ready, but she could not yet leave the harbour, as the Bristol Docks Company had not widened the entrance to the harbour sufficiently to allow it to pass through. As a consequence, the ship only finally left Bristol in January 1845 and steamed to Blackwall in London to be furnished. In July 1845, the SS Great Britain made its first transatlantic crossing in less than 15 days. However, the following September, the ship ran into trouble as its master, Captain Hosken, lost his way in heavy rain. The ship ran aground on the northern coast of Ireland, and efforts to free it were to no avail. Although the iron hull emerged relatively unscathed, Hosken had effectively written the ship off in his report to the company. At the time, Brunel was busy working on the Great Western Railway's branch lines and could not get to Ireland until December 1846. When he did, he was enraged that his state-of-the-art ship had been left, quote, lying like a useless saucepan kicking about on the most exposed shore you can imagine. After a lengthy salvage operation, the vessel was towed to Liverpool, but the Great Western Steamship Company was bankrupt and the fittings removed. In 1851, the ship was sold for a fraction of its cost. The fate of the SS Great Britain and the Steamship Company did nothing to diminish the reputation or the fortunes of the 39-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel. As the engineer of the Great Western Railway and several branch lines, Brunel continued to seek improvements to his network. He believed that steam power was dirty and expensive and sought a cleaner and cheaper alternative. On a visit to Kingstown, present-day Dunleary on the east coast of Ireland, in 1844, Brunel witnessed the operation of an atmospheric railway which was powered by nothing more than air pressure. Brunel began experimenting with the atmospheric railway on a stretch of the South Devon Railway between Exeter and Teignmouth, despite warnings from Daniel Gooch and the Stephensons that it could never work. After considerable delays, a section of track was opened in September 1847, but Brunel's atmospheric railway lasted only a year before the engineering challenges proved insurmountable, and the South Devon Railway's directors opted to convert the line to conventional steam locomotives. In addition to providing inspiration for Brunel's atmospheric railway experiments, Ireland was an obvious place for him to extend the Great Western network, which had also expanded into Wales following the completion of the line between London and Bristol. Brunel intended for a ferry service to take passengers from Fishguard in Wales to Rosslare in the southeastern corner of Ireland. From there they would be connected to Dublin by a rail running north from Wexford along the coast. Brunel was appointed engineer of the Waterford, Wexford, Wicklow and Dublin Railway. However, the project soon came to a halt and only small sections of track were built over the following decade. This was a case of the great engineer's ambitions yet again outrunning the ability to put them into action. Ireland would get its rail network before long, but Brunel was simply too early in an age when Ireland was about to descend into famine and socio-economic chaos from the importation of the potato blight from the Americas on the steamships that Brunel had designed. Yet he had plenty of opportunities elsewhere, being hired by the government of the Kingdom of Piedmont in northwestern Italy to link its capital of Turin with its port at Genoa via rail, as well as an extension from Genoa towards Milan. While Brunel made 3 visits to Italy to survey the route, frustration with the level of bureaucracy involved caused him to withdraw from the project. Instead, from 1845 to 1848, he was involved in the construction of a short rail line in Tuscany. During the 1850s, he would serve as a consultant to the East Bengal Line in India and various railway projects in Australia as he acquired a truly global reputation for his engineering abilities. In conjunction with the costly failure of the atmospheric railway, Brunel's time in the mid-1840s was taken up fighting the gauge war with other railway entrepreneurs who still believed that thinner railway gauges were the way forward. While the broad gauge dominated southwest England and was expanding into Wales, the expansion of the broad gauge into the Midlands brought it into contact with the narrow gauge lines. At Gloucester, passengers were obliged to cross the platform to change from narrow gauge Birmingham and Gloucester Railway to the broad gauge line to Swindon, while cargo would have to be physically carried from one train to the other. In July 1845, a royal commission was set up to take evidence from experts to determine a standardised gauge for the British railway network. Brunel argued that the broad gauge was smoother, faster and more efficient, and was confident that his rivals would eventually adopt it. To demonstrate its superiority, he suggested holding a series of trials. In December, Brunel's locomotive ran the line between Paddington and Didcot at an average speed of 53 miles per hour, hauling 80 tons of freight, while the Stephenson thinner gauge rival derailed at the same speed, carrying only 50 tons. Despite Brunel's victory, the Royal Commission decided in favour of narrow gauge, noting that there were already 1,901 miles of narrow gauge track in the country compared to 274 miles of Brunel's broad gauge. Stephenson's first mover advantage proved the decisive factor, but this did not stop Brunel from fighting a rearguard action that led Parliament to include a clause permitting the continued use of the broad gauge while adopting 4-foot 8.5-inch gauges as the standard size. However, the inefficiencies involved in running different gauges would eventually lead the Great Western Railway to switch to narrow gauge. The company honoured Brunel by waiting until his death before they began the arduous process of replacing the track in the 1860s. For more than a decade, Brunel had primarily worked as a railway engineer, but in 1847 the railway bubble in England popped after a decade of overinvestment known as the railway mania. Soon the boom turned to bust. Brunel was increasingly disillusioned by the railways and bought some land at the town of Barton near Torquay in Devon. Here he intended to build a grand country house for his retirement in the style of a French chateau. Nevertheless, this would be a partial retirement. He was still a relatively young man, and he continued to design impressive structures such as the Royal Albert Bridge over the River Tamar between Plymouth and Saltash as an addition to the Great Western Railway. Financial difficulties meant that work did not begin until 1854, and the structure was only completed in 1858, shortly before Brunel's death. In 1851, Brunel was also heavily involved in the Great Exhibition in London's Hyde Park and served as a judge for the civil engineering contest. He took inspiration from Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace to design a new permanent station at Paddington, a magnificent iron and glass structure which continues to be used to this day as one of London's foremost train stations. At the Great Exhibition, Brunel was reacquainted with the Scottish shipbuilder John Scott Russell, to whom he presented his plans for his most ambitious ship. A mammoth vessel almost 200 metres in length, designed to carry enough coal to make the journey to Australia without stopping to resupply. Brunel approached and secured the backing of the Eastern Steam Navigation Company to build the ship. While the SS Great Eastern would be built at Scott Russell's shipyard in Millwall in London, the project would place great strains on Brunel and Scott Russell's working relationship. Brunel had been used to having ships built according to his precise specifications, but the experienced Scott Russell was flexible in his interpretation of Brunel's instructions. A year later, in February 1855, Brunel was approached by the Deputy Secretary at War of the British government to design a new hospital for men wounded during the Crimean War, during which British and French forces supported the Ottoman Empire's territorial integrity against Russian expansion in the Black Sea region by invading the Crimean Peninsula. The government official in question was none other than Brunel's brother-in-law, Ben Hawes, who had been criticised by the nurse Florence Nightingale for his dismissive attitude towards her complaints that poor sanitary conditions in the field hospitals were causing unnecessary deaths among wounded soldiers by facilitating the spread of disease. Within 6 days, Brunel designed a prefabricated hospital that incorporated Nightingale's recommendations on ventilation and sanitation. The parts were shipped to Renkioi in modern-day Turkey in May, and the facility opened in July. Nightingale was delighted by the hospital, which contributed to a significant decline in the rate of fatalities, though it was only in operation for a few months as the Crimean War came to an end in January 1856. The remainder of Brunel's life was dominated by the construction of the SS Great Eastern, which, under its final specification, was to be over 211 metres in length, with room for 4,000 passengers, many of whom would stay in artificially lit and ventilated inner cabins. The sheer size of the ship meant that it could not be launched conventionally at a 90-degree angle as it would run aground at the far bank. Instead, it had to be built parallel to the river, While Scott Russell had built his ships by conventional methods based on wooden ships, Brunel defied convention and designed a double hull joined together by bulkheads which would provide strength without additional weight. The two hulls would be built out of standardized steel plates attached to the bulkheads by rivets. As construction progressed, relations between Brunel and Scott Russell rapidly deteriorated, and Brunel suspected that Scott Russell was seeking to take the credit for the ship's design. A combination of increases in the price of iron during the Crimean War, fires in the shipyard, and Brunel's refusal to pay Scott Russell at regular intervals caused the latter to fall into financial difficulty. Unbeknownst to Brunel, Scott Russell eventually mortgaged the shipyard. Construction work stalled when his bank took control of the facility. While Brunel attempted to take control of the whole project, Scott Russell was keen to complete the job, and Brunel reluctantly allowed him to finish the work on the hull and the paddle boxes. Scott Russell's creditors allowed the Eastern Steam Company to lease the shipyard, and the construction was effectively finished by June. There remained the challenge of launching the ship, but despite a combination of pulleys, winches, and hydraulic rams, the ship refused to move more than a few inches at a time. After 4 failed launches in November, Brunel consulted his erstwhile rival Robert Stephenson, who suggested adding more power in the shape of hydraulic rams. Brunel agreed, and by the end of January 1858, the SS Great Eastern was finally afloat with the aid of 18 hydraulic rams. Despite this success, the ship had cost the Eastern Steam Company so much money that several directors wanted to have nothing more to do with it, and a new corporate entity, the Great Ship Company, was formed by the remaining directors to acquire the ship. While the Great Eastern was a magnificent engineering achievement, the stress involved in its construction and the financial difficulties which shrouded all of Brunel's great projects contributed to a steep decline in his health in the 1850s. To recuperate, he went on an extended break to the south of France between May and September, but upon his return to London, he was appalled to discover that the ship had still not been fitted out. By the end of the year, he had been diagnosed with nephritis, an inflammation of the kidneys. Over the winter, he joined his family on a visit to Egypt. After returning to England in May 1859, Brunel regularly inspected the fitting out of the ship, but was too weak to attend the ceremonies marking its completion. On the 5th of September 1859, Brunel suffered a stroke and was taken home. A couple of days later, the ship set out on its maiden voyage without him on board. In Brunel's absence, nobody had been given overall responsibility for the vessel, and on the 9th of September the ship's forward funnel exploded, killing 5 coal stokers in the process. Bedridden at home, Brunel was distraught when he heard of the accident. It was the last straw which pushed his ailing health beyond repair. Only a few days later he died on the evening of the 15th of September 1859. He was just 53 years of age. 5 days later, he was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London. The SS Great Britain would eventually make a transatlantic crossing in June 1860, but The Great Ship Company could not afford to operate the route to Australia as Brunel had originally intended. After being sold in 1865, it was modified to lay the first telegraph cables across the Atlantic. Following Brunel's death, a group of his colleagues in the Institute of Civil Engineers decided to honour his memory by completing work on the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which had been stalled since 1843. The structure was finally completed in 1864, with some modifications to Brunel's design. Upon learning of Brunel's death, Daniel Gooch wrote in his diary, quote, "By his death the greatest of England's engineers was lost, the man with the greatest originality of thought and power of execution, bold in his plans, but right. The commercial world thought him extravagant, but although he was so, great things are not done by those who sit down and count the cost of every thought and act." Brunel's legacy can still be seen all over Britain. Many of his projects remain in use, including the Thames Tunnel, the Clifton Suspension Bridge, the Great Western Railway, the Box Tunnel, and the Royal Albert Bridge. The SS Great Britain went on to have an incredible life after Brunel's time as a passenger ship, as a warehouse and quarantine ship on the Falkland Islands in the late 19th century, and a coal hulk before eventually being scuttled in 1937. It was renovated in the 1970s and is one of the most popular tourist attractions in the port of Bristol today, nearly 200 years after it was built. Brunel is also credited as being the founder of the modern town of Swindon, where his statue stands in the midst of an unfortunately run-down shopping centre bearing his name. While Brunel was lucky to have his father's guidance early in his career, the scale of his ambition was much greater, and several of his more quixotic ideas were realised, despite how outlandish they must have seemed when he first devised them. Even before connecting London to Bristol by rail, he connected Britain and the United States by steamship. This was perhaps his greatest work, paving the way for the mass migration of tens of millions of Europeans to the Americas from Europe on steamships between 1840 and 1920. While his projects did not always enjoy commercial success, each of them demonstrated the flair and genius that made him one of the icons of Victorian Britain. In 2002, he came second in a nationwide BBC poll to determine the 100 greatest Britons. What do you think of Isambard Kingdom Brunel? Was he a genius engineer whose larger-than-life schemes helped to create the blueprint for much of Britain's transportation infrastructure? Or did his quest for perfection ultimately undermine his professional and financial interests? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.